everyone, welcome to Power Popping. I'm Allison Coe, and today I'm your hostess for Inspire Me Monday. Today we're going to be looking at making a card with the technique for paper tole. So I'm going to go right in and get started. I began by printing off actually 4 digital images, all identical in size. So I took the same original image and duplicated it 4 times on my sheet of cardstock. I actually used some Express It cardstock today, and I initially die cut my first piece. So this one is actually our base, and then I figured out that I only actually needed 3 of the images total, so these are just randomly cut out. So I started off by coloring the base for my card. So I took, let's pull this into the center here. I took my image and I decided that I was going to make each particular flower, which is our beautiful camellia. This is the digital stamp from Power Popping. And I decided that each bloom would have a certain amount of layers to it. So for instance, this large bloom here would actually have 3 layers. So I started off just deciding what layer would be on the bottom and then how much of the flower would be on the second layer, which was almost all of it. I did decide to make it 3 layers. So this is the initial layer. So I'm actually going to cut off those colored ones from this image. And then my third layer is the top layer. So that's why you need duplicate images, because you're actually going to fussy cut out the remainder of the images so that you can layer them. So I've done that with all of my blooms. I decided to keep my leaves on the base layer. It was just easier, makes for less fussy cutting as well. And so this bloom is going to have 2 layers, so I colored it twice. This bloom actually has 3 layers. I'm only going to do a single petal for this flower, and then just the outer flowers for this one, and then of course the center and the stamens. And then I also decided that my buds were going to be basically a single layer. So the leaves are on the initial layer, and then there's just one single layer for those. So I'm going to go away, I'm going to fussy cut, and we'll come back and finish this up. Alright, we're back, and I have cut all of our colored items out. So some are triple pieces, some are double pieces, and some are just singles. So everything's been cut and everything is detached. Now, before we go and actually attach everything to our card base, we're going to do a few things to our cut pieces. So first of all, and I find that if I do this first, it's much easier to do the next step. So we have all of our pieces here, and what we're going to do is we're going to actually take a stylus, which is these little fellas here, and these are just 3 different sizes, and they have a nice tip, and these basically are for making paper flowers and things like that, to help mold and shape and cup. And I basically am just going to use my medium stylus here, and I'm going to pull in my trusty dusty firm foam mat. So let's just pull these all up, and I'm actually going to flip them upside down. There we go. Now, put these into view for you guys. Alright, so let's start with this one. Sometimes I flip them over. The petals, obviously, that are a little bit more brightly colored are the ones that are going to be 3-dimensional. So we don't necessarily have to mold or sculpt any of this area here, because this is actually going to be hidden under that second piece, because this is a triple layer. Okay, so we don't have to add any curvature to that. So let's just work on the outside. So flip it over, using that stylus, pretty firm pressure. You can follow the lines. You can actually see with the Copic markers, because they bleed a little bit into the paper, where your lines of your petals are. So you can work in small circles, Depends on what area you're working on. So once again, this area right here, we're not going to work on because it's basically just going to be flat. We're just going to add a little bit of dimension. And of course, this is going to be hard to see on camera, but add a little bit of cupping to those areas. Now, if you look, it's not really flat anymore. Okay, because that stylus has pushed the paper and kind of made it round and puffier. You can actually feel it more than you can actually see it. But nonetheless, it's part of paper Tole, and I love making cards that are a little bit different and are obviously homemade. So let's do our central one here. So there's a bud kind of in the center. You can work it, and then you can work around the bud to accentuate those individual little petals of our camellias. And see, it's rather cupped. That's great. So those two are done. These are the buds. They're pretty easy. I'm just going to make them little buckets. So once again, that's cupped. This one is the center of one of the camellias, so it has a kind of a bud there and some outer fine petals. Another bud. Paper's pretty forgiving, so you can be pretty rough on it. Once again, this is one of our triple layers, so this is going to be over top here, so you don't necessarily have to cup this area. You can kind of go all around it. I'm working in C's or small circles, whatever you kind of feel is natural. Give it a fair bit of pressure. The foam mat just helps because it can be pressed down. I mean, if you were to do this on a hard surface, it just doesn't work. You can't get enough pressure so the paper pushes out. So foam mat, definitely an investment. And you can actually, you could try it on some fun foam, like a couple of layers of fun foam, but it may not be rigid enough. This stuff is pretty rigid. So I'm going to do this one pretty delicately. It's got lots of intricate edges. Okay, so there we go. There's all the pieces of our soon-to-be card front. Now, before we adhere it from this point, we need to, because this is printed and colored on white paper, white core paper, these edges are white. They're not a color. So I'm going to actually take my W5 Copic marker, working kind of this direction. Don't work with the top up. You tend to get ink on the top of your flower, and that's not what you want. You want just ink on the edges. So literally, I'm just dragging that tip. I can use the finer tip to get into those crevices there. And I'm literally going to take every single one of these pieces and do this. And if you can't get your tip in, go in from the back and just ever so slightly, just flick. I forgot a spot there. So I'm going to finish this off and we'll be right back. All right, we are back, and I've taken all of my cut items and everything has been edged with my Copic W5. A lot of crafters use the my W4. A lot of crafters actually use the W5, but I prefer the W4 just because it's not quite as dark, but it still hides that white edge. Okay, on to our next step. Now, in order to maintain all of that nice sculpting we have done with that paper, we need to use a three-dimensional adhesive. Now, I have tried this with foam tape. I use a relatively thin foam tape. It's about a 1/16 of an inch in depth, so it's not too thick, but I find it quite lumpy, bumpy, and adds, especially if you have to do multiple layers like this bud here, it would add way too much dimension and would cost you a fortune to send it through the mail. So in order to alleviate that problem, but yet still get the dimension, there's a product called Olba glue. And this is what Olba glue looks like. It just comes in a tube with a screw-off cap. It comes sealed with a little piece of foil, and it's clear. All right. Now, you could actually put this out on a scrap piece of paper and use a toothpick, but there's much better methods. That's where this little fella comes in. And Olba actually sells these to use with their product. It's actually labeled with the same, just like the glue. This is basically a syringe. So you have much more control over where your glue goes and how much goes there. So you can purchase them separately, and I've loaded my little syringe up with our 3-dimensional Olba glue, and now let's actually start putting our stuff together. So I'm going to just put these off to the side. We'll pull this to the center, and the tip is relatively thin, and let's start with the thing that's the farthest away. So you can either do it on the back of your item, or you can actually do it on the base. And I'm going to do this one on the base. So basically, because our little bud is cupped, you don't want to put the glue out towards the edges. You want to keep your glue to the center because it will spread. You can actually flatten it so that it becomes flat, but that's obviously not the purpose that we're using for. We want dimension. So I'm just going to use my tweezers here because it's just a lot easier for you guys to see and a lot easier for me to handle. And we're just going to place that on. Now, I don't know if the camera's going to be able to detect the depth, but if you look down the card, see it is raised slightly. And that's exactly the whole point of paper Tole, is you want raised surfaces that look more dimensional. Okay, let's go on to this bud here. Now, because this bud is an inner piece to this flower, which means it's not the whole flower, let's apply our glue just to this piece. So I'm just literally going to flip this over, hang on to it with my tweezers here. My tweezers can get gooey because you can just wipe this stuff off. It does have a drying time. It does not dry instantaneously, obviously, especially if you're putting a load of product on it. So let's carefully flip it over, figure out our orientation. Let's just rotate our card here. And basically you're just going to drop that onto your card. Making sure, I give it just a slight press down just to ensure that that glue is in contact with that base. And there we go, we have another three-dimensional bud. Really hard to see, I'm sorry, but it's there, it's 3-dimensional. All right, let's work on this bloom. So once again, because it's not the whole part of the bloom, let's work on the back. All right. We're going to give it a fair amount of glue. And I wouldn't go all the way to the edges because this glue leaves a glossy surface if it comes out from underneath your paper pieces. So try to be careful not to put too much glue out towards the edge, especially when you go to press it down. You risk that glue actually seeping out the edges. So go in again. Line everything up. Because my glue's in the center, I'm just going to press it out. Now, the whole reason for coloring in, even if your bloom is going to be doubled or tripled up, is just in case things move, you're going to have an undercolor that's relatively the same as your flower. I've seen some crafters actually use gray tones in those places instead of a color, but I tend to use whatever color the bloom is or whatever you're actually coloring. I find that if you have a boo-boo or if you have a slip slide, then it's nothing to worry about because that color is laid underneath. So let's work on the central part. I'm pretty generous with the glue. I'll trade it from my hand. Once again, carefully placing your bloom in. Give it a little press so that glue makes contact underneath. But of course you don't want to squish it too much, otherwise you'll lose that dimension from your paper. So there's that one. And we'll work on our large bloom here. Hopefully the camera is focusing in properly for you guys. Once again, not going out towards those edges. Putting a little bit more in the center. I mean, it's pretty on there. There's a fair amount of adhesive. I'm just going to rotate this. And it's relatively quick once you get everything colored and fussy cut. The time is, I spent more time coloring and fussy cutting than actually doing this step, which is great. You get such a neat result. Alright. See, it'll move for a while, so you have to actually set this aside, let it dry before you go in and say apply it to your card base. It needs some time to dry. So make a point of, you know, if your card is due to go in the mail today, this is not the technique to be making a card with. Alright, let's find our proper matchup here. And perfect. Careful of those under layers. Just pressing that top layer in, and we have one final little fella here. And a little bit of glue. Simple, simple. All right, and there we go. You have a fabulous paper Tole piece to go on the front of your card, and it's relatively easy. So once again, Oba glue, your best friend. Good old stylus, great tool to have with your firm foam pad, and definitely a pair of tweezers, not a bad tool to have in your repertoire as well. So thanks for joining me. I'll show you the card at the end of the video, and I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and give it a try sometime soon. Thanks for joining me.